Hey, Tay. And Tay.
Babe?
Yeah.
If you're new to Taymations, welcome! If you're already a tater, just keep being you, cutie. This is part 2 of the 10 Strata-Cut textures for beginners tutorials, where we'll go over advanced textures and building methods. If you're just getting started in Strata-Cut animation, I'd recommend watching this video first, which goes over the basics of building and animating your first time loaf, and then move on to this video, which is part 1 of these 10 Strata-Cut textures for beginners tutorials. Just like in part 1, these 5 textures will be ordered by difficulty, so feel free to stop and give each one multiple tries before moving on to the next.
Now on to the textures!
Playtime! Flipped discs. For this one, you'll need 2 colors of clay, your trusty pasta machine, and a blade. Split your colors into 3 piles each. With one of the piles of each color, we're going to roll out snakes. I shoot for them to be about the width of my thumb, but we talked about this in the last video. The size of your pinkies and thumbs is not something I'm familiar with, but it's still the perfect size, so go with it.
Oh, hell yeah!
Cut your snakes into equal lengths. I'm cutting mine to 6 or so inches. Next, roll out one of the remaining piles of each color into sheets through your pasta machine. I'm using the thickest setting on this step, which is 0 on my machine. Cut the sheets into rectangles big enough to wrap the snakes in. Using opposite colors, place a snake on a sheet and roll it until it's just fully rolled up. Cut the excess off and smooth out the seam, and then repeat this step with your other snake and sheet. With the remaining piles of clay, roll out sheets using a thinner setting. I'm going to go with a number 2 setting on this step. We'll want 2 sheets at this thickness for each color, so 4 sheets in total. Again, cut the sheets into rectangles big enough to wrap your snakely doodles in. Wrap a doodle in the opposite color, cut off the excess, and smooth out the seam. Now wrap it one more time, again in the opposite color. Follow this process with your other doodle noodle. You should have 2 nudes that look something like this. Next, we're going to slice thin medallions out of the entirety of both noodles. I'm aiming for mine to be about a 1/4 inch thick. Stack the medallions from each noodle in their own piles to make this next step easier. Stack medallions, alternating piles each time. Try to line up the circles on the face of the medallions as closely as possible until you run out of medallions. Press the piles together to help the medallions stick. Don't press too hard though, or you'll distort the lines inside. And that's a flipped disc. It's time to move on to how to slice this texture. Flipped discs need to be sliced at an angle to the camera. The sharper the angle, the faster your discs will move, and the more elongated the shape will become. Slice the front corner of the noodle off and replace it at the back of the flipped disc like so. You now have a shape that will move from right to left as you slice it.
Bonus tip.
You can wrap each finished noodle in a sheet of clay to further help keep the medallions from falling apart. This also gives the shape and outline in the final animation, which is another element you can experiment with. Lines. This is a fun one that appears simple, but actually uses an advanced technique because this is the first texture of these tutorials where we use the method of reboxing. Reboxing is a technique I alluded to in part 1 of these texture tutorials, which we'll get into in a bit. For this build, you'll need 2 or more colors of clay. I recommend 4 or more for maximum fun. You'll need your pasta machine and a blade. Roll out all of your colors into thick sheets. I'm using the 0 setting, so they extra thick. Cut the sheets into equally sized rectangles. Stack the rectangles on top of each other, alternating through your colors. Okay, so this is where we get into reboxing. Reboxing is a technique used to redistribute the pattern of a texture in such a way that it can be sliced at an easy, straight-on angle to the camera and still animate. Normally, you'd have to either slice it at an angle to the camera or prop it up at a double 45 angle for the texture to animate when sliced. Reboxing makes for easier slicing and also makes it possible to build these textures into larger, multi-texture loaves since it doesn't require such specific placement inside the loaf. Lines are the easiest texture to rebox, so it's a perfect place for us to dive in. Alright, so we're ready to do our first rebox on our line block. But first, there's something I want to show you that'll make this whole process much easier. Shout out to Eller Devane for showing me this technique. Go check out his work, it's incredible. So I've got a setup that has a camera pointing at a box I made with blue painter's tape on my cutting surface. There are two important things to keep in mind during the process of reboxing that are represented by this taped box and the camera. The first one is the camera's perspective, or what I'll call the camera axis. The second one is the slicing axis. That's represented by this line of tape, and this is the line that you'll slice your block at. I'll be referring to these two axes throughout the demonstration. I actually really recommend making a setup like this yourself while you rebox. It'll make all the slices we're gonna do throughout the reboxing a lot easier to keep track of.
Place your line block on its side, facing the camera diagonally. Keeping your knife parallel with the slicing axis, we're gonna slice through this corner all the way through the side of the block. Keep your knife as straight as you can as you slice through the block. Now we're gonna move this triangle to the back of the block without turning it, like so. Push it into the block to make it stick, but don't push too hard or you'll distort your lines. The next slice will be from this front corner through the back of the block. Keep your knife parallel with the camera axis and as straight as you can as you slice downward. Your instinct may be to put this triangle over here somewhere, but no, we're gonna move this bigger piece over here, like this. Again, push it together to make it stick. Now, following the camera axis, we're gonna slice off this part that juts out, and you guessed it, we're gonna move it from here to here. I've got a little nub here, but it has a perfect little home on this corner. I'll follow the camera axis, slice it off, and replace it where it naturally fits. Push the whole block together to make sure the lines stick. And that's a rebox line block. Easy, right? I want my lines to move from side to side, so I need to place it in front of the camera like this while I slice. As you can see, the lines would move from frame left to frame right throughout the animation. For the lines to move up or down, you just have to place it in front of the camera in this orientation, as you can see. Just be sure not to place it in this orientation, because these lines would just be static diagonal lines throughout the animation. They wouldn't animate. Always double check the orientation of your block before you start slicing it.
Bonus tip.
Cut through the length of your rebox line block in even sections and flip every other one to create this trippy banding effect. All right, we're getting pretty advanced now.
Hold on to your butts.
For this one, you'll need an odd amount of colors. I'm doing 3. It's kind of the same stuff every time, isn't it?
Anyway,
Roll your colors out into sheets. I'm using the 0 setting. Cut your sheets into equally sized rectangles. I'm using this little paper template that I also used in the line block. Overall, you want an even amount of rectangles. Stack your sheets, alternating through your colors. This is a very similar process on all these blocks. We actually call this thing a sandwich. Map out an even number of equally sized slices hot dog style on your block and slice it into strips. Carefully split the strips into 2 pieces to double your amount of strips. Using half your strips, lay them side by side in alternating orientations like so, and then push them together to stick. With the other half of your strips, follow the same process on top but in the opposite orientation as the strips below. Isn't that nice? I think that just looks nice. Map out an even number of equally sized slices hamburger style and then slice it into strips. Flip every other strip upside down so it makes this sort of checkerboard pattern. And then push them all together to stick. That's really it for the plaid pattern, but the hard part is the reboxing of this texture, so let's get into it. In my opinion, the plaid pattern works best when sliced at a double 45 angle. This makes for a much more complicated reboxing, so don't be discouraged if you don't get it the first time. I'm still learning it myself. Alright, so for this first slice, we're going to keep our knife parallel to the slicing axis and go from this top corner downward at a 45-degree angle all the way through the block. Take the little triangle cutout and move it to the back of the block on the same side without turning it, and press it into the block to stick. You should have a really weird shape like this one. The next slice is going to follow the angle of the triangle and slice off this top corner. Take your time and let the knife do the work. Without turning it, move the corner you sliced off to the front of the block on the same side and press it on to stick. Alright, this next slice is a tricky one. We're going to map the slice out beforehand, following the angles of the block all the way around with the goal of creating two equally sized trapezoids. As you can see, the lines follow the angles all the way around the block. Carefully following the lines we mapped out, slice all the way through the block to cut it in two. In this orientation, take the bottom half and move it upward to connect it at the angle. Mine here is a little sloppy, but that's okay, it'll still look awesome. Press everything together to make it stick. Now we're going to slice through the length of the block from one corner to the opposite. I like to use a clay blade to get through the thin corners, and then I'll use my knife to get through the thicker middle section. Split your block into two pieces. This next step is a little weird, so be careful. With the right half, flip 2 times. Then flip the left half 2 times. You should have two shapes that fit together perfectly, like this. By this point, your block should look something like this. Following this inside corner, place your block down straight to camera, and following the slicing axis, slice the front half off. Now you should have a shape that fits nicely to the back half, like this.
Of course, press it all together, make it stick.
And that's it. That's a reboxed plaid texture. You'll notice mine is a little long. I'm actually going to slice it in half so I have 2 plaid blocks I can animate.
Bonus tip.
The reboxing method we use for this texture works for any texture that would normally need to be sliced at a double 45. Get this method down to launch your slicing to the stratosphere. The process of building and reboxing the checkerboard pattern is nearly identical to the plaid pattern, with only a couple small but important differences. But it's important to go through the whole thing again, so let's do it. You need an even amount of colors for this one, your pasta machine, and a blade. Roll out all of your colors into thick sheets using your pasta machine.
Extra thick.
Cut your sheets into equally sized rectangles using the same template as you did in the plaid pattern. You want to end up with an even amount of rectangles in each stack. Stack your rectangles, alternating through your piles and ending up with an even amount of layers. Map out an even number of slices, hot dog and hamburger style, and then slice your block into strips, hot dog style. Flip every other strip and then push to stick. Slice into strips, and then flip every other one and push to stick. Alright, so the reboxing of the checkerboard pattern is literally identical to the reboxing of the plaid pattern. So instead of explaining through the process again, I'm just going to show it on screen to some nice music.
Enjoy. Bonus tip.
One of the most frustrating parts of reboxing the checkerboard pattern is that the small checkerboard squares tend to fall apart. Make sure you're reboxing at room temperature or slightly above it, because if it's too cold, the squares will not stick together.
Multi-texture loaf. Multi-texture loaf. Multi-texture loaf. Multi-texture loaf. Loaf texture loaf. Multi-texture loaf. Multi-texture loaf.
All right, I have a confession. This isn't actually a new texture, but rather I want to show you tips and tricks on how to combine textures into a multi-texture loaf.
Multi-texture loaf.
This is sort of what all these tutorials have been building up to, and I'm sure what everybody's been wanting to do the whole time. This won't be as long or in depth as any of the texture builds, but there are some things you can do to make this not only easier, but more interesting. So let's get into it.
First, you gotta build an assortment of textures. Then choose one for the beginning of your animation. I'm gonna go with the checkerboard. I want this loaf to start with the exploding lines and exploding tubes textures from part 1. Since both of these textures require building on top of a half sphere shape, I need to carve one into the front of my checkerboard pattern box.
Just like this.
Then it's just a matter of building the exploding lines and exploding tubes patterns on top of that half sphere shape in the same manner we did in the part 1 texture tutorial. With multi-texture loaves, it's important to fill these gaps made whenever you put different textures together, and a great way to do that is by rolling out a skinny snake, pinching the edges to create this sort of teardrop shape, and then pushing the pointy side of the teardrop into the gap and smushing it in to fill the spaces. This is a great way to fill any gaps in a multi-texture loaf. After finishing up this layer of exploding tubes, I added more exploding lines on top. So far, this block will go from exploding lines and tubes to checkerboard, and now I just gotta pick what's next. I think I'll go with the plaid pattern, why not? So this isn't a matter of just sticking these two halves together. In fact, if you were to do that, whenever you were slicing this animation, they would either fall apart at the seam, or if they did stay together, you'd have an abrupt change from checkerboard to plaid, which wouldn't look very pleasing in the animation. So let's make a transition. I'm gonna map out an angled slice downward. I'll carefully follow this angle and slice through the block. This checkerboard pattern will disappear in a downward direction in the animation. Now I just have to cut the same angle into the front of the following texture, and they'll fit together like a puzzle piece. A little tip to help them stick is to use a heat gun to slightly melt the outside faces and then put them together and push it all to stick. Now I'll just smooth out the seams on the outside. The checkerboard pattern will transition to the plaid pattern in a downward direction, and I want to do a similar transition from the plaid pattern to the next texture. You can angle it the other way for the opposite effect, or you can actually sit it down and cut the angle from side to side. I'll do a side transition for this part. I want to fill this big gap here, and I've got the perfect thing. How about a flipped disc? I'll place it at the angle I want it to sit, and then I'll cut off any excess to make it the same size as the block under it. I'll keep placing it on the block and mapping out lines to cut to make it fit the exact shape it needs to in the loaf. I want it to press up flush against that angle, so I have to map out that angle on the flip disc and cut it out. A perfect fit. I don't want this top edge to just magically appear, so there's one more angle to cut on the flip disc. Look how complicated the angles of these cuts have become. A big part of multi-texture loaves is just carving the pieces to fit what you need. Now I just need to fill in the gaps around the flip disc to make it more stable for slicing. I'll make one of those teardrop shapes with mixed pattern clay for this one, and for this big one over here, I'm gonna try to make an approximation of the shape that would fill that hole and then stuff it in and smush it to fill in the gaps. I'll use more mixed pattern clay to fill in any big gaps anywhere else on the loaf. Now I'm going to add another checkerboard block with the side transition already cut out of it, put them together, and press it all to stick. I want to end this animation the same way it started, with exploding lines on the outside, so I need to cut a half sphere shape out of this side like this. So I build my exploding lines on top of that, but wait, we have a problem. If I were to slice this loaf as is, the last couple of slices would have nothing holding them up, and they would just fall down. So I need to build a little structure here to hold the last couple slices up, and also to help hold the whole loaf in place. And to finish it off, I've rolled out a sheet of mixed pattern clay, and I'm just gonna wrap the whole loaf in it.
Like a little present waiting to be opened.
And it's done. This one wasn't difficult to make, and I guarantee it's gonna look awesome.
Bonus tip.
You did it! You conquered the multi-textured loaf. I am so proud of you. If you've watched all 3 of my Strata-Cut tutorials, you now have 10 textures and the fundamentals of Strata-Cut animation at your disposal. Improve them, change them, put them together in interesting ways, and you can make some crazy time loafs. Always be looking for ways to push it further, and share your results so we can all be better time slicers. In the next tutorial, we'll tackle a face that comes to life, so look forward to that. Hit that like button and subscribe to Taymations for more easy to follow stop motion tutorials, and as always, eat, sleep,